Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on mapping groundwater-dependent ecosystems in Boreal, Alberta, with remote sensing and machine learning. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The ABMI respectfully acknowledges that our work takes place on the territories of Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, and the Métis homeland, traditional and ancestral lands of First Nations and Métis people, whose histories, languages, and cultures are directly linked to the biodiversity that we monitor. We acknowledge the traditional teachings of the lands that we work on, and that reciprocal, meaningful, and respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples make our work possible. We are deeply grateful for their stewardship of these lands, and we are committed to supporting Indigenous-led monitoring programs while learning Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. And now a bit about our presenter today, Michael Merchant. Dr. Michael Merchant is a senior Earth observation data scientist in the ABMI's Geospatial Center and Earth Observation Insights Unit. He specializes in the development of AI and machine learning models, particularly those built on Earth observation and satellite remote sensing data. His work focuses on advancing diverse geospatial products and analytics that support biodiversity mapping, environmental monitoring, and data-driven conservation prioritization. All right, take it away, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. Appreciate that introduction. Yeah, excited to be here today to give this webinar. So my presentation today is going to be reporting on the results of a multi-year project on mapping groundwater-dependent ecosystems, or GDEs for short, which I'll use quite a bit. And the work was conducted in the oil sands region of Alberta. So the project itself focused on developing machine learning-based methodologies for northern boreal GDE mapping, so that we can use these products to contribute to monitoring and understanding of cumulative impacts within the oil sands region. So before I begin my presentation, I'd like to share a few acknowledgements. So first off, a big thank you to the collective project teams at the ABMI and Innotech Alberta, as this work was completed in partnership between our two organizations. So at the ABMI, we're a science-based organization that maps and monitors Alberta's lands and wildlife by providing long-term biodiversity and habitat data. And our partner, Innotech Alberta, is an applied research organization delivering science-based and innovative tech solutions across the province. So special thank you to all the individuals listed here who made up the project team and contributed to this work. So that includes people who supported and led various components, including fieldwork, modeling, Indigenous engagement, and project advisory and oversight. But lastly, I'd also like to thank the Oil Sands Monitoring Program, as this work was partially funded under the OSIM program. Now, the work itself is independent of any position of the OSIM program, but their funding and project support through their Groundwater Technical Advisory Committee was quite important in the success of this project. So a bit of an outline of my presentation and webinar today. So I'm going to start off with giving a bit of a background and understanding on what GDs are and or groundwater dependent ecosystems and why they're important to understand and monitor within the oil sands region. I'm then going to go into our project and provide a bit of a scope of what we did and how we mapped GDEs, and then into some of the methods, results, and some final conclusions on what we found within this project. So first off, some background on groundwater-dependent ecosystems. So groundwater itself is a pretty vital part of the global water cycle. Groundwater hosts, for example, diverse and unique biodiversity and provides a number of different essential services to humans and various species. But groundwater actually is often overlooked, especially within global conservation agendas. And this is actually quite, despite there being recent research highlighting that over half the planet's land surface actually has considerable interaction with groundwater, and that many of these areas actually have high biodiversity. So what you see here is a map developed by Sacco et al. 2023, where they mapped global groundwater biodiversity based on indicators such as recharge and ground surface water interaction and water table depth. And so what you can see on this map are, for example, dark green areas, which are what we consider hotspots. And that's where groundwater biodiversity is high and groundwater strongly interacts with surface water. Or you can compare that to light green areas where you have high biodiversity potential, but weaker water exchange. And then blue areas where there's strong exchange, but low predicted biodiversity. Now I've outlined on this map relatively where our study area is, which is part of the Boreal, where there are many visible areas of high biodiversity and ground surface water interaction. But despite the importance of groundwater in the Boreal and its clear relation to biodiversity, most groundwater-dependent ecosystem mapping in science has actually been developed in arid regions. And so the Boreal is actually an understudied and under-monitored region within this field. But what exactly are GDEs? So by definition, GDEs are ecosystems maintained by direct or indirect access to groundwater, and they rely on the flow or chemical characteristics of groundwater for some or all of their water requirements. So GDEs can encompass a diverse range of environments, including aquatic realms. So for example, springs, rivers, streams, lakes, or wetlands, or terrestrial realms, which would be vegetated land or uplands or riparian areas, or subterranean realms, which could include aquifers, karsts, and caves. But the value and importance of GDEs is quite extensive. So GDEs are the most important groundwater receptor in Alberta, for example, and that's because there's few domestic wells in the region. GDEs also provide base load for navigation, in-stream flow needs, and aquatic refugia, particularly during extreme events like drought or even wildfire. And they also support unique vegetation communities, indigenous harvesting, and wildlife and important wildlife features, such as waterholes or salt licks or water bird nesting in stopover regions. However, when groundwater is stressed within a region, the impacts can extend across a number of different systems. So that can include ecological or cultural or community systems. But GDEs are especially sensitive to changes in water quality and quantity. So for example, from industrial activities and stressors such as seepages or water extraction, which both are actually quite relevant concerns in our study area and where our project work has taken place, which is highlighted in the map in the top right. But it's not actually always clear whether impacts and shifts in groundwater conditions, so being either quality or quantity, and these effects on GDEs, whether they're actually caused by anthropogenic stressors or whether they actually fall within natural variability. So baseline GDE maps are essential for clarifying these connections and helping us strengthen our long-term GDE monitoring capabilities, which is something that's provided quite a bit of motivation for this work. So what you see here is a schematic diagram from a recent 2025 paper, which is illustrating a conceptual model of potential oil sands activity stressors. So potential mining impacts on groundwater may include lowered groundwater levels through dewatering, altered groundwater quality by mobilizing metals and organics, or disrupted connectivity, or increased cumulative stress, particularly on sensitive habitats. And since the oil sands region is underlain by bitumen-rich formations, which when extracted require quite a bit of freshwater inputs, having a general understanding of where GDEs are within this overall region and the impact on their distribution and type and conditions is quite critical for change detection and ecosystem monitoring. So putting this all together now, we can see from this diagram that impacts from oil sands activities can be clearly connected to groundwater and groundwater-dependent ecosystems. So for example, through this framework you see here, we can see that oil sands pressures, which are on the left in orange, give rise to specific stressors that alter several key groundwater mechanisms. So those lead to responses such as changes in groundwater quantity or quality, which then ultimately have effects on either environmental, social, or traditional resources, which having an understanding of these effects is quite an incentive for this overall project. So the framework here highlights the need for timely and accurate GDE mapping products and information, which are quite essential for detecting and ultimately monitoring shifts in GDE conditions, particularly in these very active regions with ongoing and expanding developments. Okay, now that we've had a bit of background, let's jump into some of the project scope and what we were doing within this work. So the overall goal of our project was to map groundwater-dependent ecosystems across the oil sands region, particularly for use in refining long-term groundwater monitoring plans and contributing to the identification of cumulative effects in both aquatic and terrestrial environments. And so what we noticed is there's quite a gap in understanding GDE distribution and exposure within oil sands development regions. So we had a 2-year project here, and in year 1, we had a particular focus on aquatic GDEs and characterization and mapping them. And we did that within 2 specific watersheds. And in our 2nd year of our project, we had more of a focus on terrestrial GDEs. And so our project was expanded to include 4 watersheds this time. And then we also were able to implement some field sampling protocols for aquatic GDE validation. So our study area was situated near Fort McMurray, and the area is part of the oil sands region, which is a region covering about 140,000 hectares of boreal forest across the province. And the study area included the Mackay and Steep Bank watersheds, which are highlighted in orange and which were part of our year 1 mapping activities. But also the Beaver and Clearwater watersheds, which are highlighted in yellow, which extended our mapping project in year 2. And so for also reference on this map is that the major oil sands mines and their spatial extents are highlighted in red. So previous work has demonstrated quite a variable but significant groundwater contributions to these tributaries of the Athabasca River. And so the percentage of those contributions, those are listed underneath the names. But we also know that within the region, quite a large portion of wetlands are actually groundwater reliant. Overall, though, the area contains a mix of upland spruce and aspen and pine forests, and also alongside quite extensive wetland habitats, so including bogs and fens, swamps, and shallow open water systems. So our year 1 research had focused on characterizing and mapping boreal aquatic GDEs. So looking at trying to identify the presence and absence indicators and GDE types that exist within Boreal, Alberta. And what we found from a pretty extensive literature review is that peatland fens and springs and water bodies with high groundwater contributions and river reaches with groundwater inputs, these were all found to be known boreal GDEs. In contrast, though, bogs and highly elevated areas and areas with higher surface water inputs or no groundwater inputs were more leaning towards more likely to be unlikely boreal GDEs. And then to support field validation as ecosystems, our research found that specific isotopes and basic water chemistry can actually be used as tracers to determine whether water actually comes from groundwater or surface sources. So this is essentially the information that helped us inform our field validation activities, which were conducted in year 2 of the project. So in year 2, we shifted our focus to terrestrial GDEs, and our literature review revealed that comparatively, there actually is quite limited knowledge on terrestrial boreal GDEs. But the literature review itself, it was based on over 40 relevant articles, but we did actually have to extend that and broaden it quite a bit just because most studies have actually looked at terrestrial GDEs in dryland or arid systems, but not in the Boreal. So what we did is we examined plant species and communities known to utilize groundwater in about the range of 1 to 3 meters, or what we're calling phreatophytes, but also species that are quite reliant upon high water tables. So what our teams came up with was a pretty comprehensive list of species and relative settings for these species, which were used to identify possible terrestrial GDE habitats. So for example, on the right, you can see that deep-rooted phreatophytes include white spruce, jack pine, and trembling aspen. And our list of flood-tolerant plants included balsam poplar, paper birch, water birch, willows, river alder, and horsetail. And since our fieldwork to date has primarily focused on and implemented aquatic validation protocols, What we did here actually is instead as we used our literature review findings and our species list and several environmental and land cover data sets to help build a rule-based and interpretive sampling method for generating our terrestrial GDE samples that we use for our modeling approach. So the rule-based method that we built used a set of if-then statements to help inform an analyst who then collected GDE samples of assumed presence or absence based on available information. So for example, the analyst looked at phreatophytes or flood-tolerant species, and then also used key data sets such as ecosite information or depth to water or soil drainage or elevation. Okay, and on to the next section, which will describe a bit more of the mapping methods. So the overall methodology for this project, it leveraged a combination of GDE training data, which as I mentioned, was collected from a combination of both field and rule-based interpretation sampling approaches, but also remote sensing data sets from multiple sources and predictive machine learning modeling. So once again, our literature review helped reveal that the most effective approach for large-scale, regional, and repeatable GDE map production, and this includes for both aquatic and terrestrial GDEs, is actually through the development and application of machine learning technologies. But more specifically, we found that a certain type of modeling approach, which is what we call ensemble machine learning modeling, has been used quite frequently and pretty successfully in this field. So this approach itself combines multiple machine learning models into a defined target to help combine their predictions to make a stronger prediction. So the processing and integration of this combined ensemble machine learning approach that I'm talking about, well, that was done using an open Python package developed by Martinez Santos. So the package and the processing performs a pretty comprehensive workflow that uses input predictor variables, so for example, remote sensing data sets, and then validated training samples to conduct a number of machine learning steps. So common steps including correlation analysis and variable importance and selection and cross-validation, followed by testing of a large number of different machine learning algorithms, and then predictive modeling. The final step of this, though, of course, is selection and combination of these models, which again is this process of combining predictions into one final output. Now, the reason we chose this overall workflow of ensemble modeling, which as you can kind of see here is this schematic that combines predictions from multiple base learners, is that by using a team of models, or instead of just using one model, is we can actually reduce the noise and any unwanted variability in our final predictions, which are known to result in more stable and reliable results. And the reason this is so is because different machine learning algorithms have different strengths and can capture different patterns. So combining their outputs allows us to take advantage of the best aspects of each high-performing model for GDE mapping in this case, while basically discarding those that don't actually contribute much to the process. So to inform our mapping workflow, our teams collected and pre-processed about 23 different geospatial layers, and you can see those on this slide and the following one. And these different layers were used as explanatory inputs for our ensemble machine learning modeling. So these variables came from many different sources, including the Alberta Geological Survey, Government of Alberta, and also open geospatial platforms such as Google Earth Engine. And so the list of variables included topographical inputs and derivatives from satellite and airborne sources, hydrogeology layers relating to aquifers and drainage and water depths, and also various remote sensing measurements, including spectral and thermal measurements from optical and radar Earth observation satellites. In addition, we also included climate variables. So one of high relevance being a variable called aridity, which is an index related to landscape dryness and evapotranspiration and rainfall. But also, quite importantly, we also included several wetland and vegetation cover layers. So as you can see on the right, the generalized wetland class input, which I describe as being a broad categorization of wetlands such as fens and bogs, And the more detailed wetland form input, which are more subdivisions such as tree fens or tree bogs, those are highlighted because they were examined more closely in our modeling approach. So what we did is we actually tested the effects on the inclusion and absence of these wetland layers in our models, given we just know that there is such a high relevance of wetlands to the occurrence of GDEs. So by incorporating these various wetland layers into our framework, this allowed us to test three specific modeling scenarios, which were absent, class, and form modeling approaches. So absent can be considered models with no wetland data included. Class is considered models with wetland class data, and form being models with wetland form data. And again, we specifically wanted to answer the question, does a machine learning model with generalized wetland class data have a different performance than a model with more detailed wetland form data, or a model with no wetland data at all? So training and validation samples for our aquatic GDE mapping, those were collected from various data sources and from our targeted field campaigns in year 2 of our project. And our sources used to collect the data included information from the Oil Sands Monitoring Program, from the Government of Alberta, from the Alberta Geological Survey, the Regional Aquatic Monitoring Program, wetland inventories, and of course our own fieldwork. But from these various sources, we used available data on water chemistry and flow and isotopes to help classify sample areas as either being absent or present of an aquatic GDE. So the results of this process produced over 400 aquatic present samples and over 200 absent samples. And then for terrestrial GDEs, again, we relied on the use of our expert and logic-based rule set to help identify and interpret model training samples. So this approach used ecosite phase, depth to water, and soil drainage layers to help select areas across our study area that are more likely to support terrestrial GDE occurrence. So what we did is we intersected these layers and screened locations so that we could assure that our training samples came from areas with a high likelihood of being a true terrestrial GDE, even in the absence of a direct infield a set of infield observations and data sets. So similar to our aquatic GDEs, this process resulted in over 400 present samples and over 200 absent samples. So once our GDE training and testing reference data set was compiled, we then had a pretty important decision to make in our project, which was, do we actually model our aquatic and terrestrial GDEs together in one single model, or do we predict them separately or in sequence? And to support this decision, we did a pretty detailed statistical review of our explanatory variable set based on the samples that were collected in our previous reference data set. So we assessed how much each variable actually overlapped between these two GDE types by looking at density plots that you can see on the right here. And looking at those density plots, what we produced was, or what we calculated was a metric called overlap index. And the overlap index results, what that showed us was that most variables had at least a medium to high overlap, and that many of these density plots between aquatic and terrestrial GDEs were actually not statistically different from each other. And so what that said is it suggested it was appropriate to model both GDE types together in a unified model, particularly since the predictor variables shared enough similarities, and because separating them into two models would likely introduce some unnecessary complexities without potentially even improving discriminatory power. So with that, we can get into some results now. So our modeling framework, again, it allowed us to evaluate numerous different machine learning algorithms, so 18 in total, and we assessed those across our three different modeling scenarios, which were MLA, so no wetland data included or wetland absent, MLC, so models with our generalized wetland class data, and MLF, which are models with more detailed wetland form data. And our results showed that models incorporating either class or form wetland data, so that's the purple and the orange lines, that those consistently outperform models without wetland data, so in comparison to the green lines. And that confirms a number of different things. And first off, that confirms essentially the strong relationship between wetlands and ecosystems reliant on groundwater, but also that either wetland class or form data can produce strong and relatively comparable mapping results, especially when averaged together in this ensemble approach, which is actually quite an important finding because class inventory data is far more readily available than form data across the province. And so there's implications here for potentially scaling this work across broader oil sands or boreal regions. But looking more closely, we were actually able to identify 4 specific machine learning models or algorithms that performed exceptionally well under these 3 scenarios. And so those can be seen in the graph on the right, where models were ranked from highest to lowest accuracy and area under the curve, or AUC, which is a very common model performance metric. But what we found was we noticed is that after these 4 models, algorithm performance dropped quite significantly. So this essentially gave us or provided us enough data and justification for forwarding these top 4 models, as you can see in the gray box there, into a final model ensemble. So what you see here now are the classified results, the classified mapping results of those 4 individual high-performing models, but specifically for the wetland form data scenario. So while wetland class models perform quite seemingly well as the form models, and even better in some cases, when we actually average this information into a final ensemble, what we found is the wetland form output was particularly best at reducing GDE omissions, whereas the wetland class ensemble had more kind of conservative results and reduced false positives. So with that in mind, what we deemed was that it was most appropriate by our team to use the form outputs in our final ensemble, since this would be particularly best for applications where it's important to avoid missing true GDEs, even if it meant a bit more slight overprediction. So the 4 best algorithms that formed this ensemble were extra trees and random forest, nearest neighbor, and gradient boosting, which are 4 widely popular models in machine learning modeling. But each of the outputs, they actually, they did perform quite well, but with notable difference in strengths. So for example, some of the models were better at capturing certain GDE types over others, while some were better at reducing false positive rates. But yes, nevertheless, each of these models statistically performed very well, and as a result, were forwarded into our final ensemble map. So to understand which variables were most influential in this mapping and predictive modeling process, what we did is we quantified which predictor variables were used most frequently in our top 4 models. So in doing this exercise, it highlighted a specific set of geospatial variables that are most important for GDE prediction. So first off, very notably, as you can see in relation to the stars in the graph here, is that 5 variables that were recently added into our framework based on our terrestrial literature review. So that's drainage heights and radar data, albedo, and landscape aridity. Those were used most frequently in our various models, which essentially confirms that they have quite a high relevance in a combined terrestrial and aquatic GDE modeling approach. Those variables, though, they were accompanied by other water and vegetation variables. And importantly, as you can see at the top of the graph there, wetland form inputs, which of course remain a critical predictor in this framework for GDE mapping in the oil sands region. And here's our final GDE map. And this was built by averaging those outputs of the 4 best machine learning models, which resulted in a predictive and quite accurate map of GDEs across our study area, which the map itself was evaluated at about 90% accuracy. So in order to create this map that you see here, the GDE probabilities have been classified from very low, so those are in the dark red areas, to very high, which are the dark blue areas. And we did that by grouping probability steps together. So for example, 1 to 20% being very low, or 80 to 100% being very high. Qualitative evaluation of this map does highlight several different things. So for example, hydrological features and flowing systems such as river reaches and fens. They were identified quite well. But also riparian areas and other terrestrial GDEs that were in close proximity to rivers and wetlands and headwaters. Those are also identified and mapped very well, which is an important spatial finding since these terrestrial systems were seemingly more challenging to characterize, and because mapping them in boreal settings has been quite a new development. Now, additionally, when we overlay the regional mapping footprint, we also see that there are many high probability GD areas in the dark blue that are in close proximity to mines, which could potentially be areas of focus for monitoring or change detection and further evaluation, especially in regards to resource use or developments. Okay, and on to some conclusions from this project. So to summarize, overall, this work found that, well, a couple of things. And first is that machine learning is highly effective for this mapping task, but also that multi-source remote sensing data is quite critical for mapping both terrestrial and aquatic GDEs combined. Also, though, there is quite a bit of opportunity here for this work to influence cumulative effects monitoring, such as by comparing this product with water level data to see where monitoring may best be located. But also there's potential for Indigenous engagement. So this was something that was confirmed through an earlier oil sands monitoring program webinar, where there is significant interest from Indigenous communities in GDE mapping and also potential future involvement. Lastly, there are some important potential next steps. And one of those is to implement our field-based validation of terrestrial GDEs to help complement our interpretive rule-based system. Another is to improve the explainability of our machine learning models, since as of right now, they are considered to be relatively black box in how their predictions are made. And three, we'd also like to see continued methods development and testing as part of a provincial GDE mapping program, so that Alberta can have sufficient baseline data and information to inform provincial groundwater management moving forward. And to conclude, I'm quite pleased to say that our overall project, through a successful partnership with the ABMI and Initech Alberta, that we were able to produce the first regional map of groundwater-dependent ecosystems within a large portion of the oil sands region using a combination of geospatial and machine learning technologies. So the methodology we implemented is based on scalable and repeatable and cost-effective remote sensing data, and can provide objective, data-driven, and accurate GDE predictions for use in understanding the extent and location of GDEs in boreal forest environments. And with that, that is the conclusion of my webinar. I just want to say thanks to everyone joining today and listening in. There's also QR codes for information related to the project and the work, and various contact sources in my email if you had any more questions after the webinar. But thanks everyone for listening.